The world had decided Abel's life was worth less than the rusted nails holding his shack together. The formal letter from the county clerk, delivered by a rider who didn't want to linger, said as much in its careful, cursive script. The property was condemned, a public nuisance on the edge of the salt marsh, and would be burned by the fall if no claimant came forward. As Abel's only living blood, the claim, and the attached bill for back taxes amounting to a sum Isaac did not have, fell to him. It took Isaac 3 months of selling off the last of his breeding stock, 3 months of watching the prairie that had been his life shrink to the size of a memory, to scrape together the $96 needed to settle the debt and travel to the coast. He arrived with an old golden retriever whose joints were stiffening with the same quiet dignity as his own, a stillbag with a change of clothes, and a heart so hollowed out by the loss of his wife, Martha, that it no longer seemed to echo. He had come not to claim an inheritance but to perform a final, weary duty for a brother he hadn't seen in 20 years. He had come to bury a ghost and sweep out his house. What he could not have known, as he stood with his dog, Buck, before the leaning structure that sagged like a tired man's shoulders, was that the world was wrong about his brother. And in the wall of that condemned shack, wrapped in oilcloth and silence, was a truth so profound it would not only make him a rich man in the eyes of the world, but a whole man in the eyes of his own soul. This is the story of how that happened. It is a story about what we decide is worthless, and what endures. And if you'll stay with me, I promise you, the ending is worth the journey. The journey itself was a kind of unraveling. At 54, Isaac felt less like a man and more like a collection of worn-out parts. His hands, once capable of pulling a calf or stringing a mile of wire fence, were now maps of swollen knuckles and silvery scars that ached with the memory of work. He'd buried Martha 2 years prior, and in doing so, had buried the part of himself that knew how to speak of anything other than the weather or the price of feed. Her absence was not a sharp pain but a constant, low-grade pressure, the way the vast, empty sky of the plains presses down on the land. Without her, the ranch they had built from dust and hope became just land, and the land began to slip away. A parcel sold to cover a bad year's losses. Another to pay the doctor. What was left was a small house and a silence that grew louder each day. Buck, his aging retriever, was his only confidant, a warm and steady presence who understood the language of sighs and the geography of grief, often resting his heavy, graying muzzle on Isaac's knee as if to tether him to the present moment. The letter about Abel was an intrusion, a stone tossed into the still, murky pond of his life. Abel, his younger brother, had always been a creature of the margins, a man who seemed to vibrate at a frequency others couldn't hear. He'd left the plains for the coast decades ago, seeking something Isaac never understood, and the silence between them had grown from years into a chasm. The news of his death was a distant, theoretical sadness, but the shack, the condemnation, the debt, that was real and hard and required action. So he sold the last of his cattle, packed the few things Martha hadn't wanted him to part with, and rode east, toward the water, leaving behind the only life he had ever known. He arrived at the edge of the continent with the sun setting behind him, casting his long shadow over a landscape of grey water, whispering reeds, and a single, derelict structure that looked like it had been coughed up by the tide and forgotten. The air tasted of salt and decay, a smell so different from the dry dust of his home that it felt like arriving in another country. The shack was worse than he'd imagined. It was a study in destitution, its boards bleached and splintered, its roof a patchwork of hope and failure. Yet, as Buck whined softly at his side, Isaac felt not despair, but a strange, quiet resolve. This was the end of a story, his brother's story, and his job was simply to close the book with dignity. The door hung crooked on a single leather hinge, groaning in protest as Isaac pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick and close, a damp, musty blanket woven from mildew, brine, and the faint, sour scent of a life lived in solitude. A single room, smaller than his own tack shed, held the entirety of his brother's world. A narrow cot with a threadbare blanket, a small, cold stove, a table with one chair, and a scattering of debris that spoke of a slow, quiet surrender. Empty tins, a broken cup, the brittle, curled pages of a book whose cover had long since been devoured by moisture. It was the kind of poverty that was not just about a lack of money, but a lack of hope. For a moment, Isaac felt a surge of anger at his brother. Not for the debt, not for the shack, but for this. For the sheer, unadorned sadness of it all. He had imagined Abel living a different life, a strange life perhaps, but not this. Not a life that ended in a room that felt more like a grave than a home. Buck padded in cautiously, his nose twitching, and sneezed at the dust Isaac's boot stirred up. The sound broke the spell. There was work to be done. He started by throwing open the single, grime-caked window, letting a sliver of salty air and fading light pierce the gloom. Then, he began to clear the room, his movements methodical and detached. He worked without stopping, bagging the trash in old grain sacks he'd brought, stacking the few salvageable items, a cast-iron pot, a lantern, outside. He was a machine of duty, his grief and confusion channeled into the simple, physical act of cleaning. Late in the afternoon, weary and coated in a fine film of grime, he leaned against the interior wall to catch his breath. And that's when he felt it. A give. A subtle, hollow echo where there should have been solid resistance. He pressed again, this time deliberately. The boards flexed, just slightly, but it was enough. His rancher senses, honed by years of noticing the one sick calf in a healthy herd or the subtle shift in the wind that precedes a storm, came alive. He ran his calloused fingers over the rough-sawn planks, feeling for a seam, a nail, anything out of place. He found it near the floor, a single board whose edge was not flush with its neighbors. Using the pry bar from his saddlebag, he worked the tip into the gap and gently, carefully, levered it out. It came away with a soft sigh of old wood, revealing not the wall's dark interior, but the clean, planed face of a hidden cabinet door. The cabinet was flush with the studs, its craftsmanship a stark, jarring contrast to the crude shack built around it. The wood was dark and smooth, fitted with a precision that spoke of patience and skill. There was no knob, only a small, inset leather pull. Isaac hooked a finger through it and pulled. The door swung open silently on well-oiled hinges, revealing a space not much larger than a footlocker, its interior lined with dark felt. And inside, nestled like priceless eggs in a secret nest, were dozens of cloth-wrap bundles. They were arranged in neat rows, each one tied with a simple length of twine. A strange reverence fell over the room. The last of the day's light, now a deep, burnished orange, streamed through the dirty window and seemed to pool inside the hidden compartment. Buck, who had been sleeping in a corner, rose and came to stand beside Isaac, nudging his hand with his wet nose as if to ask what he had found. Isaac didn't know. He reached in and lifted out the nearest bundle. It was heavier than he expected, dense and solid. He sat on the floor, the dust motes dancing in the slanted light, and carefully untied the twine. He peeled back the layers of oiled cloth, the material stiff and fragrant with linseed. What was revealed took his breath away. It was a duck. A pintail, its head canted slightly, its long tail feather perfectly rendered. But it wasn't carved from wood. He turned it over and over in his hands, his practical mind struggling to understand what he was seeing. It was made of reeds, thousands of them, pressed and layered and bound so tightly they formed a seamless, solid body. The surface was lacquered to a smooth, hard finish and painted with a naturalist's precision, the subtle iridescence on the drake's head, the fine vermiculation on its flanks. It was impossibly light, yet it felt substantial, real. It was a masterpiece. One by one, he unwrapped the others. A pair of green wing teal, their wing patches flashing like emeralds. A solemn-faced canvasback. A ruddy duck with its tail cocked in belligerent display. There were 31 of them in total. A silent, breathtaking flock, each one a perfect, frozen moment of life. At the very bottom of the cabinet, beneath the last decoy, was a thick, leather-bound ledger. Isaac lifted it out. It was heavy in his hands, heavy with the weight of unanswered questions. As darkness finally claimed the shack, he lit the old lantern, its glow pushing back the shadows, and opened the book. The first dozen pages were filled with a small, cramped script that Isaac recognized instantly as his brother's. But it was not the looping, carefree hand of his youth, this was the careful, deliberate penmanship of a man recording something of immense importance. The entries were technical, almost scientific. The marsh gives you the best reeds after the first hard frost, one entry began. They must be split thin, the pith scraped away, leaving only the outer skin. Boil them in salt water with a knob of pine resin until they are pliable as leather. Isaac read on, mesmerized. Abel had documented every step of his secret art. How to press the reeds into molds of his own design. How to bind them with deer sinew, tightening each wrap until the form was as hard as stone. How to mix pigments from ground clay, charcoal, and berries, suspending them in fish glue to create paints that would not fade or run. It was the life's work of a master craftsman, a meticulous record of a technique that, as far as Isaac knew, existed nowhere else on earth. He felt a pang of something sharp and unfamiliar, not pride, exactly, but a profound respect for the brother he thought he knew. The recluse, the failure, had been harboring a secret genius. But then, about a quarter of the way through the book, the entries began to change. The technical notes became interspersed with other notations, written in the margins at first, and then taking over the pages entirely. They were names. And dates. And stories. October 1872, he read. Finian, age 8, arrived with the fever and nothing else. Hair the color of straw. Said nothing for a week. Gave him the small sandpiper to hold. Isaac's breath caught in his chest. He turned the page. March 1874. The Miller family. Lost their youngest to the cough that winter. Their wagon was broken and their spirits more so. I fixed the wheel and gave the mother the green-winged teal. She wept. Said it was the first beautiful thing she had seen in a year. The ledger was not just a record of craft, it was a record of compassion. Abel had not been a hermit. He had been a sanctuary. The shack was not a retreat from the world, but a quiet, steady lighthouse for those lost in its storms. He had been taking in lost and abandoned children, runaways, orphans, the forgotten debris of westward expansion. He fed them, sheltered them, and when they were ready, sent them on their way, often with one of his perfect, useless birds as a parting gift. The decoys weren't for luring ducks. They were for anchoring souls. Isaac closed his eyes, the lantern light flickering on his face. The image of his brother shifted, recrystallized. The man who had lived in squalor had been surrounded by a wealth Isaac couldn't comprehend. He had been trading in a currency of kindness, his account book filled not with dollars, but with dignity restored. A week passed. Isaac worked on the shack, but his labor was different now. He was no longer clearing a ruin but restoring a legacy. He patched the roof not just to keep out the rain, but to protect what was within. He scrubbed the floor, patched the walls, and reglazed the window, his hands moving with a purpose they hadn't felt in years. He slept on the cot, with Buck at his feet, and each night he read more from Abel's ledger. He learned of a girl named Sarah who was afraid of the dark, and how Abel had painted the breast of a snow goose with phosphorescent minerals so it would glow by her bedside. He read of 2 brothers, Marcus and Peter, who had run away from a cruel apprenticeship, and how Abel taught them to fish and mend nets before finding them a place on a northbound schooner. The ledger was a testament to a life lived in radical, hidden service. One afternoon, as he was replacing a rotted board on the small porch, he saw him. A boy, standing at the edge of the property where the marsh grass met the firmer ground. He was perhaps 15 or 16, thin as a whip, with a mess of straw-colored hair that fell into his eyes. He wore clothes that were little more than rags, and he stood perfectly still, watching Isaac with a guarded, feral intensity. He did not speak, did not move, just watched. Isaac remembered the entry in the ledger. Finian, age 8. Hair the color of straw, could it be? It seemed impossible. That was years ago. Yet the description was uncanny. Buck gave a low growl, but Isaac quieted him with a hand. He didn't approach the boy. He simply went back to his work, hammering the nail with slow, deliberate strikes. He was aware of the boy's presence the way a mariner is aware of the tide. The boy stayed until dusk, a silent sentinel at the edge of Isaac's world, and then, as the light failed, he melted back into the reeds. He was there again the next day, and the day after that. On the 4th day, Isaac left a plate of bread and jerky on the porch railing and went inside. When he came back out an hour later, it was gone. The next day, he did the same, but this time he sat in the open doorway, his back to the porch, reading from a newspaper. He heard the faintest creak of a floorboard, the softest of sounds, and then silence. The food was gone. The boy, whom Isaac had started calling Finn in his own mind, grew bolder. He began to do small tasks, unasked. One morning Isaac woke to find a neat stack of firewood by the door. Another time, he found a leaking bucket had been expertly patched with a piece of tin and pine tar. The boy's hands were clever, his work silent and precise. Isaac never tried to force a conversation. He would simply say, "Thank you," into the empty air, trusting the words would find their mark. One evening, Isaac brought one of the decoys out onto the porch, a small sandpiper, and set it on the railing as he cleaned it. Finn, who had been lingering nearby, stopped. His eyes fixed on the bird. He took a hesitant step closer, then another, drawn by a force stronger than his fear. He reached out a tentative, grimy finger and traced the painted feathers on the bird's back. His touch was not one of curiosity, but of a deep, bone-deep familiarity. It was the way a man touches a sacred object from his own past. In that moment, Isaac knew. The boy from the ledger had come home. The news of a stranger occupying the old hermit's shack rippled through the small, scattered coastal community in the slow, inevitable way that news does. Most of it was idle gossip, but for one person, it was a call to action. A few days after Finn's silent return, a buckboard wagon, pulled by an old grey mare, made its way down the overgrown track to the shack. Isaac watched it approach, a familiar tension tightening in his gut. He was a man accustomed to solitude, and the steady stream of the past into his present was unsettling. The wagon stopped, and a woman, her face a beautiful, intricate map of deep lines and her hair a crown of white braids, slowly climbed down. She moved with the deliberate grace of the very old, her back straight, her eyes clear and focused. She carried a small, cloth-wrapped bundle in her arms as if it were a swaddled infant. She stopped at the foot of the porch steps and looked up at Isaac, her gaze direct and unblinking. She was not there to be hostile, she was there to bear witness. "You're his brother," she said. It was not a question. Her voice was like the rustle of dry leaves, soft but clear. "I am," Isaac replied, his own voice sounding rough and unused. "I'm Isaac, I am Mrs. Gable," she said simply. "I heard you were here. I had to come." She shifted the bundle in her arms. "Abel gave this to my mother more than 30 years ago." She carefully unwrapped the cloth, revealing a small, worn decoy of a sandpiper. It was one of Abel's, unmistakably, but its paint was faded and chipped, its body worn smooth in places from the touch of countless hands. It had been loved. "My father had died on the water," Mrs. Gable continued, her eyes fixed on the bird, but her story was for Isaac. "We had nothing. My mother was sick with grief. We were packing what little we owned to move inland, to live with relatives who didn't want us. Your brother found us on the road. He gave us food. He fixed our wagon. And he gave my mother this." She looked up at Isaac, and he saw that her clear eyes were now swimming with tears. He told her, "A thing made with care is a prayer for the one who receives it." He said it was to remember the shore, but to not be afraid of the journey ahead. She paused, taking a shaky breath. "That little bird, it sat on the mantel in every house we ever lived in. It was the only beautiful thing we owned. When my mother was dying, she gave it to me. She said it was a promise. A promise that even in the hardest winter, there is kindness in the world." She finally let the tears fall, and she did not apologize for them. They were owned. Isaac felt a thickness in his own throat. He looked at the worn sandpiper, then at the 31 perfect birds hidden in his wall, and he finally understood their true value. It had nothing to do with money. They were not objects. They were promises. Each one was a testament to a single, quiet act of decency that had rippled out across generations, a circle of grace expanding in the water. Finn, who had been watching from the shadows of the doorway, stepped out into the light and stood beside Isaac, his presence a silent affirmation. The old woman, the quiet man, and the lost boy. They were Abel's unlikely, unintended congregation. Word of the birds, however, is a different kind of thing than word of kindness. Kindness is quiet. But a treasure, even a secret one, has a way of making noise. The story of the recluse's shack and the valuable art found within began to travel, morphing and growing with each telling. It traveled up the coast on fishing boats and inland with traders, eventually finding its way into the drawing rooms and offices of the city. And that is how Mr. Harrison found Isaac. He arrived not in a dusty buckboard, but in a polished black carriage pulled by a pair of high-stepping bays, a vision of wealth and sophistication against the rustic poverty of the marsh. He was a man made of smooth surfaces, polished shoes, a tailored suit, a face so affable and charming it seemed incapable of a frown. He introduced himself as an antiquarian, a collector and purveyor of fine and unusual American folk art. He spoke in a low, confidential tone, as if he and Isaac were already partners in a grand enterprise. "I heard a rumor," he said, his eye scanning the humble shack with a flicker of professional appraisal, "of a most remarkable discovery. A lost art form." I had to see for myself. Isaac, wary and unaccustomed to such polish, did not invite him in. He stood on the porch, a silent gatekeeper, with Finn a watchful shadow at his side. But Harrison was not easily deterred. He spoke of museums in Boston and galleries in New York. He used words like provenance and preservation and posterity. He painted a picture of Abel as a forgotten American master, an artist whose genius must be shared with the world. "These pieces, Mr. Isaac," he said, leaning in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "they don't belong gathering dust in a shack. They belong to history. And, of course, the finder of such a treasure should be handsomely rewarded for his stewardship." He then named a sum. A number so large, so detached from Isaac's reality of $96 and a life of making do, that it barely registered as real. It was a figure that could buy back his ranch, and 10 more like it. It was a figure that could erase a lifetime of financial struggle. For a dizzying moment, Isaac felt the pull of it. He saw the plains, he saw Martha's face, he saw a life of ease he had never dared to imagine. Harrison saw the flicker of temptation in his eyes and smiled, a practiced, predatory closing of a deal. "Think of it," Harrison murmured. "You would be a wealthy man. All you have to do is let me save this art from obscurity." But then Isaac looked past Harrison's shoulder, at the marsh, at the whispering reeds, and he thought of Abel's ledger. He thought of Finian, age 8. He thought of Mrs. Gable's tears and the worn sandpiper that was a promise. These birds were not made for history. They were made for people. They weren't art to be saved from obscurity, they were acts of love to be remembered. "They're not for sale," Isaac said, the words plain and solid. Harrison's smile didn't vanish, but it tightened at the edges, the affability curdling into something harder. "Every man has a price," he said, his voice losing its warmth. "You'll find yours." The second wave of visitors was not charming. They were family. Or, rather, they were the family of Abel's wife, a woman he had married briefly and disastrously in his youth, long before he had retreated to the marsh. The Claytons. Isaac remembered their name from a single, bitter entry in Abel's ledger. "They value a man by the weight of his pockets," and found mine wanting. They had heard the same rumors as Harrison, but their interest was not in art, it was in assets. They arrived a week after Harrison's departure, not in a fine carriage but in a cloud of self-righteous dust, accompanied by a thin, dour man in a city suit who introduced himself as their lawyer. The patriarch, a stout man with a florid face named Thomas Clayton, did not bother with pleasantries. "We've come for what's ours," he announced, gesturing at the shack as if it were a palace he was reclaiming. "Abel was married to my sister. By law, his property reverts to her next of kin." "That's us." The lawyer stepped forward, brandishing a sheaf of papers. "My clients have a legal claim to the estate of the deceased Abel, including all contents of the property, discovered or otherwise. Your claim, as a distant brother, is secondary at best. They had come to take it all. The birds, the shack, the legacy they had ignored when it was worthless and now coveted because it was valuable. They were not evil men, they were merely legible. Their greed was as plain and common as dirt." Isaac felt a weariness settle over him, a deep fatigue that had nothing to do with physical labor. He had fought the land, the weather, his own grief. He did not have the strength to fight this. He looked at their hard, expectant faces and felt the impulse to simply walk away, to let them have the birds and the trouble that came with them. But then he saw Finn, standing defiantly on the porch, his thin arms crossed, his face a mask of fury. He saw Mrs. Gable's tear-streaked face in his mind's eye. He felt the weight of the ledger, which he had taken to carrying with him, tucked inside his coat. He was not just Isaac anymore. He was the keeper. And the keeper does not abandon his post. The confrontation took place right there, in the salty air, with the gulls crying overhead. The lawyer began to speak of legal statutes and inheritance law. Community members, drawn by the raised voices and the sight of the Claytons' wagon, began to gather at a respectful distance, a silent, watching jury. Isaac let the lawyer finish. Then, instead of arguing, instead of protesting, he simply pulled the ledger from his coat. "My brother left a record," he said, his voice quiet but carrying in the still air. He opened the book. And he began to read. He did not read the parts about the reeds or the sinew. He read the names. Finian, age 8, arrived with the fever. He looked directly at Finn as he said it. Sarah, who was afraid of the dark, the Miller family, their youngest taken by the cough. He read the accounts of Abel's quiet, tireless charity. He read of repaired wagons, mended nets, and hungry children fed. He read the story of a man who had nothing and gave everything. The lawyer tried to interrupt, to object, but the words had a power that law could not touch. The gathered crowd was silent, listening to the litany of small kindnesses that, woven together, created a life of staggering moral beauty. Thomas Clayton's face, at first smug, began to flush with a different kind of color. He was not being accused of a crime, but in the face of his brother-in-law's profound generosity, his own avarice was laid bare for all to see. It was a shaming, quiet and absolute. The reading did not last long, but its effect was devastating. When Isaac finally closed the ledger, a profound silence had fallen over the small gathering. It was not an empty silence, but one filled with the weight of revelation. The Claytons stood exposed, their legal claims and grasping hands rendered absurd by the simple, powerful truth of Abel's life. Thomas Clayton looked at the faces of the community members, his neighbors, and saw not support, but a cool, quiet judgment. He looked at Isaac, holding the book like a shield. He looked at the strange, fierce boy standing beside him. There was no victory to be had here. Without another word, he turned, gestured brusquely to his family and the lawyer, and climbed back into his wagon. They left as they had come, in a cloud of dust, but this time it felt like a retreat. Mr. Harrison did not even bother with a second visit. A short, curt note arrived a few days later, delivered by a local boy, offering a final, much-reduced price for the collection of curiosities, a last, contemptuous attempt to turn a profit. Isaac used the note to light his lantern. He was left in peace. The shack, the birds, the ledger, and the boy. They were his. But the victory was not triumphant. It was quiet, and it was heavy. He was no longer just Isaac, the widowed rancher. He was the keeper of his brother's legacy, a role he had not asked for but could not refuse. The richness he had inherited was not the kind that could be spent. It was a richness of purpose, a responsibility that settled into his bones. The transformation was slow, almost imperceptible at first. He found himself looking at the world through different eyes. He saw the bruised reeds along the marsh not as weeds, but as potential. He saw the lost, hungry look in a stranger's eyes not as a threat, but as a question. One afternoon, he found Finn sitting on the porch, attempting to rewrap the worn sandpiper Mrs. Gable had left with them, its sinew bindings having finally given way. The boy's clever fingers struggled with the unfamiliar task. Isaac sat down beside him. He did not take the bird from him. Instead, he picked up a length of fresh sinew. "You have to pull it tight," he said, his first real instruction to the boy. "Tighter than you think." Finn looked at him, his usual guarded expression softening with a flicker of curiosity. Isaac began to show him, his own gnarled hands moving with a slow, remembered grace, guiding the boy's nimble ones. He explained how to warm the pine resin, how to work it into the fibers of the sinew to make it strong and waterproof. He was speaking the language of the ledger, the words of his brother coming through his own mouth. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the marsh, Isaac looked at the boy beside him, his head bent in concentration, his face illuminated by the warm, golden light. He saw the line in the ledger, Finian, age 8, and the reality of the boy in front of him, and he understood that this was the truest inheritance. It was not the birds, but the knowledge. Not the treasure, but the trade. He was not just the keeper of the flock, he was to be the teacher of the next generation. He looked out at the water, at the real birds taking flight into the twilight sky, and he felt a peace he hadn't known since Martha was alive. A thing made with care is a prayer for the one who receives it. His brother had been praying for years. And now, it was his turn.